Nick Norwitz might go on Twitter and say, I ate nothing but 9 cans of sardines for a month, and this is what happened. And it tells you nothing about his mortality.
That's
So
right.
the claims that we see online, and Norwitz isn't saying sardines are going to help you live longer, but rapamycin had a moment. People were taking metformin thinking that that was going to extend their lives. And there's no way to do a study in a human being without this decadal longitudinal time frame.
Yeah.
Blood pressure, those findings were one of the ones that got people scared because blood pressure is actually a subclinical marker with some meaning. You might not feel symptomatic, but when we measure chronic hypertension, we know from the Framingham study how dangerous that is to human longevity. The dang thing about that is the medical establishment, we're talking about the allopathic centralized medicine, can leverage the fear that people have of an asymptomatic or I use the word subclinical, that's probably not the right word, but an asymptomatic chronic illness that is going to eventually, bite them in the butt by being correlated with a risk of heart disease or some other catastrophic end to their life. And the blood pressure guidelines have been getting stricter and stricter in order to encourage people to go on things like ACE inhibitors. In other words, the Framingham study got it right, but the therapies were wrong. It
You're
led
right.
to fear mongering about sodium and whatever it is. It didn't get people to a place where they learned what they could do about their blood
There's
pressure.
there, there's famously a whole class of drugs that was developed that are still widely prescribed today called beta blockers.
Right.
And beta blockers have a tremendous impact on blood pressure. They lower blood pressure. And then in the longitudinal studies, though, they found that people were still dropping dead when they were on beta blockers, even though they had lowered blood pressure.
It's a
So
classic case of treating a lab rather than treating a human being. We've moved your lab marker, but we don't really know what that's going to mean.
that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Well,
So that's the best you could do, as you point out. Humans, I mean, in some ways, um, the fact that if you're going to do experiments on yourself, which I'm all in favor of,
me too.
you have to have quick feedback. So you have to have surrogate markers. You can't wait until you die to see how not to die.
Well, those sardines didn't work out.
That's right. Let's have a do-over.
Well, it brings up Steve Jobs. He had ideas about pancreatic cancer. He resisted the surgery that was recommended. And I don't know if nobody knows whether the surgery would have saved his life, but he had ideas like, I'm going to go on a fruit diet or I'm going to go on a pescatarian diet or something like that. He didn't have the feedback. He didn't have the routine, the fast tempo feedback of what was happening in his blood markers at the time. Why aren't the wearables? It's been, 15 years since Jobs died. Why aren't the wearables doing the job?
We touched on it briefly, but just let me expound or pontificate a little bit further. If you think about where medicine, the field of medicine, is getting its information, all the really good information, blood pressure is kind of an anomaly because it is completely non-invasive. It's one of the few exceptions to what I'm about to say, but almost all medically relevant data is coming from blood. 70 or 80% of all clinical decisions are based on blood labs. And so that's the reason why wearables are not really cutting the mustard, is because they're not measuring the right thing. They're measuring things that are too low level to be able to provide the feedback that you need, even as a surrogate marker. They're too blunt and they're too smooth, if you will. You think about, a lot of us have Apple Watches and iPhones, and we measure tracks and steps, and we measure heart rate and heart rate variability, and we look at our graphs. And they are very gently moving slopes, right? They don't, there's not a lot of dynamic range to those measurements. So put it in double E terms, there's not a lot of sensitivity and there's not a lot of dynamic range. So it's all about choosing the right data. I came to believe after I left Apple, I came to believe that that information was going to be in blood. And that's the harsh reality. You do need a little bit of blood. You don't need much, but you do need a little bit of blood to get this information. And we knew that. We knew that in the 70s with glucometers and ketone meters and so forth.
So if we're talking about measuring the right things, why is ESR the right thing instead of C-reactive protein?
Well, they're both right. They're both good markers. It comes back to that information feedback loop. CRP is it's a chemical assay. So, in order to measure the level of CRP in your blood, which exists in nanomolar quantities in your blood, it's a tiny, tiny little signal in your blood sample. You need a fairly complex piece of instrumentation. You need a clinical chemistry analyzer. Those cost about a half $500,000, and they sit in. They're made by people like Abbott and Siemens, and they sit in central or regional research reference laboratories. So they're incredibly sensitive, and you can get CRP data from those. There's not currently a way, and you could collect your sample at home and send it off to a lab too. So that's how some people have tried to simplify that loop. But it's going to be, I want to build a lab in the home because I want to be able to not have to wait the week or 2 weeks that it takes to get the data back if you mail in your sample with a dry blood test. Because I think that's the only way to close the loop. I think that's the only way to create this engagement loop. CRP is a it's a very scarce thing in blood, and it's only reflecting one inflammatory protein. So CRP is one protein. It's produced in the liver. It's a very good protein. It can tell you a lot about inflammation, but and so I thought about that, and thought about, could I build an instrument based on measuring CRP in the home? Um, and then I happened upon ESR. ESR was how inflammation was measured. You know, um, in the very first NHANES data set, ESR is measured. So it was the standard of care for inflammation for many, many years. And it just turned out, from an optics and hardware perspective, it was easier for me to build an instrumentation based on ESR. So now, is ESR a good marker? So if you go to the literature, you find that, yeah, absolutely. It's a really great marker. In fact, it reflects more inflammatory pathways and different inflammatory proteins than any other marker. So instead of just CRP, it is reflective of CRP levels, but it's also reflective of fibrinogen levels, and it's also reflective of various cytokine levels. So it's going to see more causes of inflammation than CRP is. So I've become I've come to really like ESR for its causality. It's very well studied, and its broadness, and as a thing you're going to measure frequently, to enable a consumer feedback loop. It's far and away the better marker than CRP to do that, just because you can't get the CRP number quickly.